So we finished yesterday. We have been looking at our reform lines. They're erased now. We've done the board work there is from the question and answer session. But we have been looking at our primary reform lines, 144,000, priests, Levites, Nethinims. And then we drew our focus onto this last dispensation, the one that we primarily want to understand, of 2014 to 2019, for us, our latter rain Sunday law history. We went there not primarily to focus on our experience, although that is entirely relevant, but to focus on the experience of the world as they go through their history of ploughing. So I want to do a little bit of revision of that. We erased the board work for that. So I'll plot it again. I might actually... We did the line of the priests. Focusing more on the last three dispensations. 1989 to 9/11. The history of our ploughing. (9/11) to 2014. And what we're currently discussing, this history of 2014 to 2019. I didn't do that intentionally how I wanted it. So I'm going to move that backwards. We need to move it this way. I think this pen might be out. Do we have another pen, a black pen? If we have one. I'll work in blue unless we find another. We have 1989, 9/11, 2014, 2019. We understand before 1989, what history do we have? Ten-year warning for the church. We're aware of that? We're all comfortable with that? We have this 10-year history. Then we enter our ploughing. 1989, what happens? The message is opened up. Someone is raised up to give that message. And we talk about in this history the increase of knowledge until 1991, and then it's formalized in 1996. We're all familiar with that. we understood that in this history, 1996, we have a message arrive that's going to test God's people. And if you're tested, there's a true answer and a false answer. The true answer being the Time of the End magazine and the message given by Elder Jeff Pippinger. We didn't discuss in detail 9/11 to 2014. We know that pattern repeats. Our focus drew to 2014 to 2019, the history of our latter rain. Again, a message opens up. There is an increase of knowledge, 2016, and it is formalized in 2018. So this is the story of the priests. Then we noted that this dispensation of 14 to 19 impacts how many groups of people? 3 groups of people. So moving from the priests, we moved to the Nethinims. I don't want to discuss the Levites in these series of presentations. So we moved to the world, the Nethinims. I just want to refer to them as the world. We understand that their time of the end is when? 2014, and there begins their ploughing. So they are ploughed from 2014 to 2019. And prior to 2014, they must have a 10-year history where they can wake up to the external events and be prepared for what is about to happen. There's 2 waymarks in this history of 9/11 to 2014, isn't there? Just want us to note that. The history of 2009 and 2012. 2009, 2012, the increase of knowledge and the formalization of our early rain dispensation. I want us to note as we look at some passages, some secular passages today about the history of 2009 and 2012, and remember that we place them also into this 10-year history for the world, what they're meant to be seeing. So in the history of 14 to 19 for the world, worldwide there's going to be an increase of knowledge and a formalization of a message. In our history, there is someone raised up to give that, yes? So who have we been discussing? Who have we been discussing in our presentations for the world? Michael Moore. We started tracing his history. We understood that it was October 3, 2018 that the internal message was formalized for the priests, and we understood that that message was given through the months of September and October 2018. We went externally and we looked at 2 messages also given to the world in the months of September and October 2018. Two streams in every dispensation, a false and a true. We traced that true stream as a documentary by Michael Moore, where he speaks about Trump's victory in 2016 and it's known as Fahrenheit 11/9. What he's doing here is a play on words. He well knows the significance of September 11, 2001, when he sees what occurs not just at 9/11, but in the history surrounding 9/11. He writes a documentary, produces and releases it in 2004, known as Fahrenheit 9/11. So he's picked up in 2004 the significance of September 11. Is it just about September 11, 2001? No, it's also about the illegitimacy of George Bush's presidency, corruption within the Republican Party, etc. So it's about the events surrounding it, but he focuses on the date September 11 in the title. You come to 2018 and he's seen the rise of Donald Trump as another significant factor. Then we listed all the similarities between our message and his message. They're at the beginning of their reform line. They don't have the foresight of prophecy, so there are elements that we don't expect them to agree with us or to recognize on. But still, we find the message closely aligned to our own. That Trump is a dictator. We find Trump being described as the last president. He lines up 2014 as a significant launch pad that brought us to the state of affairs where Donald Trump even could be elected. And then he also focuses on November the 9th, though in retrospect. Also lining up Donald Trump with Adolf Hitler, that rise of nationalism and populism. He's seen the similarities between what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s and what has happened within the United States. We took Michael Moore, identified him, and we went back to our own history. We looked at the two streams of information that we've been teaching all year, 18 months now, about what happened in 1996 with information. A brother yesterday took us to YouTube to show the introduction of YouTube in 2004. We can go to 2001 and see Wikipedia. So we see these technological advancements, and we place many of them in 1996. When it comes to the predecessor of WikiLeaks, Google, the search engine Google, but particularly focusing on external news sources. We speak about Fox, who has really become the spokes or the voice, from the very beginning, the voice for conservative Christianity with a political spin. And the true stream that we call CNN, but really that's just a phrase that covers all the other streams that either began in 1996 or went online. The Washington Post, the New York Times, they're old newspapers that have now become digitalized in 1996. Also Yahoo News, 1996. So we saw how we can take these external streams and bring them back to the line of the priests. Because even though we talk about the line of the world, everything's working off the line of the 144,000, even the line of the priests. They're all just fractals of the line of the 144,000. So if these people are significant, we should be able to then take and trace them back into the time of the end, the beginning of the line of the 144,000. Because we know that these people are significant all the way through to Sunday law. And Sunday law is a waymark, Daniel 11:41, on the line of the 144,000. So while we build a story for the world, we also have that overarching line to remember. We identified Michael Moore's first documentary in 1989, It's called Roger and Me. And it's all about Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan, the subject of his documentary in 1989. 9/11, he produces that into a documentary released in 2004. 2014, there's another crisis in Flint, Michigan, which becomes a focus point of his documentary Fahrenheit 11/9. So he's pinning the rise of Donald Trump, one of the causes symbolized by this crisis and the mismanagement of government he saw in 2014 in his hometown. That's all revision. Do we have questions or thoughts based on that? My brother.
So I want to know when Michael was writing the first book of Roger and Me. Are we marking just his writing or there is a significance of the book? What is in the book?
This isn't a book. These are all documentaries. So Fahrenheit 11/9, Fahrenheit 9/11, and the one in 1989, Roger and Me, they're all documentaries. It's really tracing the societal issues in America. So I would suggest the content is significant, but also the individual himself, because he becomes the person in this history, formalizes the message for the world.
Okay, and when you know that you're talking about Fahrenheit 11/9, is it for 2016 or 2019?
It's released in late September 27 through October 2018. Because this is where their message is formalized.
So the subject is talking about there is for 2016 about Trump.
The subject really covers this whole history. The message of our midnight cry, that wasn't just for 2018 or 2019. It's spanning this whole dispensation. It's a message that those who are faithful in this dispensation needed to hear and understand and accept. So when Michael Moore releases this documentary, he's just encapsulating what people are understanding about Donald Trump, how he's repeating the history of Hitler, how he, unless there's some type of revolution, will be the last president of the United States because he's a dictator, highlighting November 9th, 2014. So it becomes a formalization of a message that to be successfully plowed as a Nethinim must be understood in the dispensation of their plowing. Does that make sense? So we can just compare and contrast this history, our latter rain, with their plowing, because what tested us tested them. Is that clear? Tested on the same things. But we also need to recognize that they are being plowed. So just like we were plowed and we had a 10-year history leading up to it, and then someone raised up to give that message, so they were plowed from 2004 to 14, and then someone was raised up to encapsulate that message. Who else did we mention in that history? There was someone else. AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. And when was she born? 1989. So are these people significant just on this reform line? The world? No. I would suggest that while we have to structure them into the reform line of the Nethinims, they're significant on the reform line of the 144,000. Here we've just drawn the priests, but we know that we begin in the same fashion. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, born October 13th, 1989. Enters politics in a huge upset, November 6, 2018. So I want to remind us of just a little bit of the history that led to this dispensation. To do that, we need to go beyond the line of the Nethinims, back to the history of 1979 and before. So we understand the history of slavery. Slavery ended. We went to the Jim Crow era, segregation, Ku Klux Klan, the systemic racism in the United States, went through their judicial system. It's still in there today. And we come to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, you see Martin Luther King, he stands up, he starts speaking about equality between races, ending segregation. And what is the response of the leading evangelicals in America? What's their response? Do we not know it, or are we all just quiet today? What's the response of the leading evangelicals to the civil rights movement? It's okay if we don't know it, because then I'm going to go over it more slowly. My sister, do you know how they responded? They didn't agree with the civil rights movement. They didn't agree, but I would take those words in their most extreme. They were violently opposed to it, weren't they? We're all familiar with that history. Do we know some of the names of that history? Do we know those leading evangelicals? Paul Wyrick. What's our number one? Jerry Falwell. So we have Jerry Falwell stand up. They use other issues. They use also attacking against the feminist movement, fighting against later on the introduction of abortion, but that was really an excuse. What began their movement, their political movement to give the religious community a political voice, began as a backlash to the civil rights movement. And that was particularly the work of Jerry Falwell, who led in that. So this 10-year history, 79 to 89, is the history of the moral majority. In 1989, the society dissolves. They've placed in power Reagan and Bush. 1996, he does some political campaigning again. Come to 2001, Reagan has been a conservative president, but not radical as they wanted. George Bush came in, he was a conservative president, but not nearly as radical as they wanted. In between them, they have Bill Clinton, and he's a Democrat. So how is their moral campaign going? Not very well. 2001, September 11, Islam strikes, and what is their response? Jerry Falwell's response, Franklin Graham, Anne Graham Lotz, Billy Graham's two children, Paul Wyrick. What's their response to the September 11 attacks? They say it was the judgment of God because of America's immorality. So they say September 11 is God judging the United States because of all of those feminists and all of those homosexuals, all of those transgender people, all the immoral people that aren't following Christian morality, and they say it's the fault of the government for not enforcing morality. So while the history of the moral majority did its work, began our reform line, placed Reagan and Bush in, the institutions are still too strong. You go through the history of Bill Clinton, a Democrat. Then you go through the history of George Bush. He was not as radical as they wanted. Then comes in Obama, and now what kind of trouble are they in? Now they're in terrible trouble because Obama is a Democrat and he does not believe in the union of church and state. Just as Obama is elected and becomes president, what crisis hits America? Raise your hand. As Obama became president, what crisis was America in? Sorry? Economic crisis. 2008, 2009, the global economic collapse. So 2009, there's this economic collapse. And that is what Obama inherits as he's becoming president. This economic collapse, it created a political movement within the United States known as the Tea Party movement. Do we all know where they get that name from? Raise your hand if you know that, my brother. Sorry? Can you give us some history, what happened, just as broad as you want to?
The Boston Tea Party, they organized that they wanted some representation in the government. So they made that movement as a request that they should have a representation in the parliament.
What year was the Boston Tea Party? Does anyone know? 1770? 1773. What began soon after? The American Revolution. So it was the Boston Tea Party that began the American Revolution, where they gained independence from Britain. So when this financial collapse happens, the government bails out the big banks. And a lot of people become angry at this. They create this Tea Party movement, and it is extremely conservative. Conservative in the extreme. This is a far-right movement. And it's, even Donald Trump, he says later, but in his early years as president, that his presidency, the road to his presidency began with the Tea Party movement of 2009. The fact you have this far-right, conservative, political movement begin in the United States. So again, we have these two waymarks, 2009, 2012. I just want us to note, even in this dispensation, this lead up to 2014, the significance of 2009. The global financial crisis began in 2008, but it hit its rock bottom in 2009. And it's then that the Tea Party began. 2012, you have this conservative, far-right movement in America directly opposed to Obama's re-election. And how do they go with that? Not well. In 2012, Obama is re-elected. Re-elected as president. I'm going to list, if I can, some sources I'm going to read. I'll list them on this board. But there's a documentary that is done that I would suggest everyone watches. There's quite a good source of independent journalists who put together documentaries. You may be familiar with them. They're known as Frontline. They do very good documentaries on Donald Trump, on the rise of Vladimir Putin, and they do one on the issue of immigration in the United States. It's done a little bit more recently than some of those others. And they interview some very key people. When it comes to the immigration debate, one of the people actually on that documentary speaking for himself is Steve Bannon. So we're going to quote the man directly. It's known as Zero Tolerance. So it's a Frontline documentary. You can find it on YouTube. And it's known as Zero Tolerance. He's going to give some history of how he began to impact politics in America. This is the narrative he gives. 2012, Obama's re-election We went backwards, quite a bit backwards, but then we highlighted the Tea Party movement, the fallout of the global financial crisis. Then we come to the re-election of Obama. It's in 2012 when Obama is re-elected that those conservatives really come into unity and decide at all costs that they must bring in a conservative president in 2016. Not a conservative president after the model of George Bush father or son or even Ronald Reagan. They want a final ultra-conservative president who's going to implement what they have been wanting for years. 3 outsiders in 2012 came together to transform the Republican Party, make Trump president, and introduce a harsh new approach to immigration. The story begins in 2012. The aftermath of Mitt Romney's loss in the presidential election set off a soul-searching by the Republican establishment. But for a small group of hard-right conservatives, the defeat was a call to arms. Steve Bannon decides that he's going to bring together a coalition to reform the Republican Party. Now we teach if we're going to do a work for the world, what must happen first? First, we must sort out the church, yes? We have to sort out the church before we can do a work for the world. So what is Steve Bannon saying? If he wants to impact the world, what does he have to impact first? The government of the United States. We say, church, in how many steps? Priests, Levites, and then the world. How broad is Steve Bannon's vision? What is he hoping to change? Just the United States? Why did he go to Europe? For Steve Bannon, his plan was for this to be a global movement. That's why he's trying to take down the European Union, dismantle NATO. He's planning a worldwide movement. Don't we expect that at the Sunday Law? This isn't just about changing America. This is about making global change. But Steve Bannon recognizes that before you go to the world, what does he have to get to first? First, the United States. In how many steps? 2. And what is his very first step? The Republican Party. His own political party. Because his own political party, in the history, really in much of its prior history, it is right-leaning, but it's not far right-leaning. It's not that conservative. It's not that radical. He needs to bring in a new radical Republican establishment. Get rid of all of these middle-of-the-road Republicans who are happy to work with Obama. So his first job is to take down the middle-of-the-road Republican establishment. He still sees, have you heard him say the swamp? When he says the swamp, who is he referring to? Raise your hand. Who does he mean when he's talking about the swamp? Raise your hand. Immigrants? No. The Rogers? Establishment? What is that establishment composed of? That's the point I wanted to make. When he's talking about the swamp, he's talking about the government of the United States, Congress, the House, their agencies. He's talking about all that governmental system. But he's not just referring to Democrats. When he says the swamp, it's not some Democratic swamp. For him, the swamp is Democrat and Republican. And he wants to drain the swamp. He wants to remove all of those middle-of-the-road, lukewarm, willing to work with Obama Republicans and bring in radical far-right Republicans. So first the Republicans, then the rest of the government must be dismantled, the three branches, and then a worldwide work. So in 2012, he decides that the time is ready to change the Republican establishment, and he brings in two other allies. He brings them together in a meeting in Breitbart Embassy in January of 2013. So it's January 2013, and he brings together two other allies. Leading them is Steve Bannon, and then his two allies are Stephen Miller. Do we all know who Stephen Miller is? Do we all know the name Stephen Miller? I'm going to put him up here as homework. Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions. Do we all know who Jeff Sessions is? So by the time we come back tomorrow, can we all have looked up Stephen Miller and Jeff Sessions? I suspect many of us are more familiar with Steve Bannon than either of them. Jeff Sessions probably coming second and Stephen Miller probably coming third. Jeff Sessions is no longer part of Trump's White House government. Neither is Steve Bannon. Stephen Miller is still there. We should know him very well. He is the brains, the driving force behind all of Trump's immigration policies. So in 2012, Steve Bannon decides to take on this course of action. He brings together these men in January of 2013, and they have hours-long meetings in Breitbart Embassy. And they decide that the very first step they must take is in the 2014 midterm election, to take down the House Majority Leader, Eric Cantor. So they're going to take step number one in 2014. They're going to take down Eric Cantor. He is a Republican. He's part of their own political party that they all either work for or ascribe to, but he is one who Steve Bannon would refer to as the establishment or part of the swamp. He's a mainstream Republican, and he's willing to compromise with Barack Obama. They wanted to take someone down from within the Republican Party. In the Virginia primary election, they took down the Republican House Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, and they used the immigration issue to do it. Eric Cantor was compromising on the issue of immigration with Barack Obama, bringing in much kinder, softer immigration reforms. So they used this issue of immigration to using information media streams to make Eric Cantor lose his own election. Fox News joined them in this effort. This is the first time in US history that a sitting House Majority Leader is defeated. This marks the Republicans getting off the immigration bipartisan reforms they had been participating. Quote, "This was a turning point on the immigration issue. They accomplished two things. They killed the immigration reform bill that was a compromise between Republicans and Democrats, and they brought in a far-right Republican." Laura Ingraham, a Fox News host, she said in that history in 2014, she said, "This could be the turning point for the Republican Party. This could lead to big things." And it did. This is what led to the election of Donald Trump. It was the beginning of the transformation of the Republican Party. You come to 2015, Trump stands up. Jeff Sessions endorses him, Stephen Miller endorses him, Steve Bannon endorses him. They aid him in his election process, and then they form his White House government. Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, Stephen Miller, his senior advisor, and Jeff Sessions becomes the Attorney General of the United States. A little down the track, after Trump's election, Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump start to publicly disagree about the Russia investigation. You may know the history of Jeff Sessions recusing himself. And Jeff Sessions decides that he's going to retire as Attorney General. Steve Bannon, quoting here Steve Bannon directly. Steve Bannon goes to Jeff Sessions and he says, "You were there, Jeff Sessions, you were there from the very beginning. You were riding shotgun with me the entire time. Do we know what it means to ride shotgun? If we were to go in a car and you were to go, if I was driving and you were to sit in the front passenger seat, that's what it means to ride shotgun. You're at the very front of the car." So Steve Bannon is telling Jeff Sessions from the very beginning, before Trump even entered the scene, you're at the very front of this movement. I said to Jeff Sessions, is there any doubt in your mind that this was divine providence that put us here, that put Trump in power? Right? This didn't just happen. Something has worked here, because Donald Trump is a very imperfect instrument, but we are here, and you are never going to quit. And Jeff Sessions says, I am never going to quit. So Steve Bannon talks Jeff Sessions out of quitting by saying, you were there for me from the very beginning. Back in 2012, 13, 14 and 15, they led in the work that got Donald Trump elected. And then he says, do you really think that this was some type of coincidence, that this isn't the providence of God that saw Donald Trump win that election? And Jeff Sessions agrees with him and agrees to not retire. I won't go through the rest of that documentary, I just want to highlight it. That this is how this movement began. It's not just Donald Trump, it is a movement that led to the election of Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump has been the front person for that movement. But it began prior to him, really beginning in 2014 with the defeat of Eric Cantor, the beginning of the transformation of the Republican establishment. I want to go to another source. I would encourage everyone to read this one as well. This is a Vox News article. And again, people don't like Vox News. They see it as too left-wing. But all they're doing is quotes of Steve Bannon. We don't need to hear their interpretation of what Steve Bannon is. We just need to quote the man himself. The title of the article is In 2014, Steve Bannon explained his worldview. In 2014, Steve Bannon explained his worldview. This year, he helped craft a visa ban that fit it. Now, I just want to give some quotes that Steve Bannon makes. Trump may have signed the executive order that was the immigration bill they're referring to, but Steve Bannon has been the person behind the scenes directing how Donald Trump handles the immigration issue. And in this article, they're going back to a speech that Steve Bannon made in 2014. And where was Steve Bannon when he made this speech in 2014? He makes it at the Vatican. So he's at the Vatican. Why is Steve Bannon at the Vatican? He's a strong Catholic. Strong Catholic. He says at this conference that godlessness and libertarianism have sapped the strength of the Jewish Christian West to defend its ideals. And the Muslim world is growing in number every day that we refuse to look at this as what it is, and the scale of it, and the viciousness of it, will a day where you will rue that we didn't act. So what's the problem for Steve Bannon? Libertarianism and godlessness. What is another term for godlessness? Immorality. At the conference in the Vatican, attended by some of Europe's most conservative religious voices, Bannon made a case for an international populist conservative movement, explained what he believes are the biggest dangers facing the Christian world, and downplayed the roles of racism and bigotry in far-right movements. Bannon believes that there was a golden age of economic prosperity in the mid-19th century, 1940s, 50s, really 1950s and 60s, as a time of peace in the Western Hemisphere. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, he says, the world has come off track. So when does Steve Bannon believe everything has gone wrong? 1989 to 1991, since the fall of the Soviet Union. He says the underlying principle is an enlightened form of capitalism. It kind of organized and built the materials needed to support it, whether it's the Soviet Union, England, the United States, etc. Capitalism generated tremendous wealth, and that wealth distributed among a middle class, a rising middle class. People who come from real working class environments and created that 1950s, 60s idealistic view of America. Really, it's the 1950s kind of era that Trump is referring to when he says, "Make America great again." Quoting Steve Bannon, "One thing I want to make sure of, if you look at the leaders of capitalism at that time, when capitalism was at its highest flower and spreading its benefits to most of mankind, almost all of those capitalists were strong believers in the Jewish Christian West. They were either active participants in the Jewish faith or they were active participants in the Christian's faith. And they took their beliefs, and the underpinnings of their beliefs was manifested in the work they did." And I think that's incredibly important and something that would really become unmoored. I can see this on Wall Street today. I can see this with the securitization of everything that is. Everything is looked at as a securitization opportunity. People are looked at as commodities. Not quoting him, back to the article. Jewish Christian ideals have a long history in conservative movements, from Barry Goldwater to Ronald Reagan, emphasizing the importance of traditional American religious values in all aspects of life. The notion feeds the image of a simpler and more homogeneous nation, which Trump largely signaled to throughout his campaign. Therefore, Bannon's crisis of capitalism, as he talks about earlier in his remarks, is paired with a crisis of faith, a weakening of Jewish, Christian ideals, morals, brought on by the recent popularity of secularism and the growth of the Muslim world. So what is Steve Bannon fighting for at the Vatican when he says the Jewish Christian West? Conservatism isn't just political rhetoric. What I want us to say is that this is a religious movement. He goes back in this article, he goes back to 2009 and the financial crisis. He sees the Tea Party success from 2009 as being instrumental to Trump's victory in 2016. So if you want to see the connection to 2009, this article will give it to you more clearly. He goes back to demonstrate this was a global revolt. speaking about Modi in India, etc. Quoting him, "We are the voice of the anti-abortion movement," and he's clever. He's always clever in his speeches. He's speaking to Catholics at the Vatican. He knows to bring up abortion. He always has them on side if you bring up abortion. The voice of the traditional marriage movement against homosexuality. And I can tell you we're winning victory after victory after victory. Things are turning around as people have a voice and have a platform of which they can use. All of this and then farther down, this whole article becomes significant, how he speaks about Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin, while he says he doesn't endorse Putin, Putin is another key leader. Before Trump, before this ever began, he was trying to convince the world to protect Jewish Christian morality. So how he speaks about Vladimir Putin. But all through this, what I want us to take from this article and go and read it for yourselves is that what is driving Steve Bannon? Sorry? Religion, isn't it? Because if I just drew up the history of the Tea Party movement and Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions, the issue of immigration, Trump's election, this all looks secular and political. What I want us to see is that this is not politics, this is religion. It's religion that is driving every one of these men. When we go to 2018 and we talk about the Trump prophecy, that's easy. We can speak about Liberty University and Jerry Falwell Jr. and those conservative leaders, Paula White. All of that is important and significant, but that's a little like our surface treasure. Paula White didn't orchestrate the election of Donald Trump. Steve Bannon orchestrated the election of Donald Trump. And we get into problems if we think that somehow this conservative movement that has arisen is political in nature. It's come through politics, it's impacted politics, but it's not political, it's religious. What they're fighting for is the enforced morality of the Jewish Christian West. And where have we seen that before? The moral majority, the very beginning of our reform line, led to Ronald Reagan. This is a religious movement that led to the election of Donald Trump, where it's Jerry Falwell or Steve Bannon or Stephen Miller. And it continues to be a religious movement today. Why do they not want immigrants? Are they happy to have white immigrants from Christian countries? No problem. It's not about immigration, it's about the type of immigration. They do not want immigrants of color or from South America or from Muslim countries. They're not blocking all immigrants, select type of immigrants, because they're trying to protect an America that for them is white and conservative, traditional marriage-based, and Christian/Jewish. So now that do we have any questions or thoughts on that so far? The fact that this is a religious movement that Steve Bannon led. Yes, brother.
Okay, you have said about Jeff Sessions. You said that when he was convinced, he said, I will not retire. Did he retire later on?
In the end, he was really fired.
Why was he fired?
When the Russia investigation began, as Attorney General, Jeff Sessions was supposed to be involved and oversee the investigation regarding Russia's interference and Trump's relationship to that interference. And he recused himself from that investigation. In other words, he stepped back and said, I'm compromised, I can't fulfill the role of Attorney General. And that made Trump very angry because it meant that Jeff Sessions wouldn't protect and defend him. So it was over the Russia investigation that Jeff Sessions didn't do Trump's will in that investigation. And it took some time, but in the end, he really was essentially fired. but he hasn't stopped fighting for Donald Trump. Even though they might, and we see that in the Zero Tolerance documentary, they refer to Donald Trump as an imperfect instrument. So they don't necessarily like him or agree with him on everything. But they still fight for him because he's the instrument they need to bring about the change they want. So we can see two different movements here, yes? The ploughing of the Nethinims begins, and you have this divide, this split begin. We went through the history of Michael Moore and AOC and how they have arisen. We went back to 1989 and traced their rise, but particularly traced them from 2014. So we have two movements. One of them, you could say Steve Bannon. You could talk about the moral majority. Jerry Falwell. Those you can place, depending on your story, as beginning in 1989, or if you want to do the story of the Nethinims, you can see them beginning here. Depends on your narrative. At the same time, we start to see, now that we're into the ploughing history, another movement arise. In the same time period, you see Michael Moore, AOC, and what is known as the Squad, who are essentially fighting for civil rights. That famous phrase of AOC where she says, I may misquote, essentially, LGBT rights are civil rights, are human rights. They're fighting for human rights in general, through the government, not to be impacted by anyone's religious beliefs. Can we see the parallel movements, particularly from 2014? Doesn't that become necessary? Because how many streams must you have? Two. You must have a true stream and a false stream, developing from 2014, breaking clearly into the open in 2018, developing throughout that history. So if you're to be a successful Nethinim, what side must you be on? Can you have a foot in both camps? What issue divided most clearly? It's a really neat issue in 2019 that demonstrates what side you're on. Because people, for many of those years, they say, I have a foot in both camps. I'm staying out of this political mess. And then it came to the impeachment, and what happened? People took sides. That impeachment was necessary. It was necessary to divide one class from the other. And once you went through that impeachment process, many of those people who thought that they could keep a foot in both camps, they chose one side or they chose the other side. By the time we get to the end of 2019, just last month, we've seen a clear divide within the United States, not just the United States, within the world, over the impeachment process. Do we have any questions or thoughts so far? Yes, my brother.
Now, where do we place Pelosi?
She's up here. AOC was, I think, the first person, maybe not the first person. She endorsed Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House. They have their disagreements. But when push comes to shove, they have each other's back. So that's how we've observed so far the ploughing history of the Nethinims. We've taken our ploughing history, brought it across, compared and contrasted. Ploughing of the priests, ploughing of the church, ploughing of the 144,000, however you want to conceptualize that. Ploughing of the church, ploughing of the world. Then we also identified our internal issues in this dispensation are the exact same in their ploughing dispensation. Our latter rain lining up with the history of their ploughing. Two streams of information in each dispensation, therefore they must have two streams of information. We went back to the two subjects we've been teaching for 18 months now. Those two sides developing that we conceptualize as Fox and CNN. those conservative voices through the moral majority, the opposition to civil rights, through the Tea Party, Steve Bannon, and how this has become a religious conservative movement to enforce Jewish Christian morality through the government. At the same time, you see Michael Moore, AOC, these other voices, also drawing people to a position where they can see that the United States is in crisis, that Trump is a dictator, Hitler, as we taught, that he's the last president, as we taught, 2014 being a turning point, as we taught, the significance of the date of November 9. The question, yes, my brother.
Yeah, what happened in 2016 in relation to Michael Moore, the line of movement?
2016 is an external event here. I know Michael Moore's speaking throughout this whole history, but this isn't specifically a documentary. We know the Midnight Cry message wasn't speaking in 2016 either, but 2016 becomes the focus point of the Midnight Cry message given in 2018. So 2016, the election becomes the focus point of Michael Moore's formalised message, Fahrenheit 11/9 in 2018. Internal message, the Midnight Cry, the focus point is Trump and his election. Formalised message for the world, their formalised message, focus point 2016, Trump's election. Does that make sense? It all becomes easier when we compare and contrast. So the question I want to ask before we close, this is the history of the ploughing of the world. We come down to Panium. This is their early reign. Panium to Sunday law. Their latter reign. Sunday law to Daniel 12:1. Their harvest. When do we impact the world in a major way? Come out of her, my people. So, who wants to raise their hand and tell us what this looks like? What does this dispensation look like? I know that people have fought over this issue, they've debated this issue. Some people have suggested given some thoughts I would suggest are quite radical. We're all quite good in private and on WhatsApp. I don't want people to be afraid to speak those ideas now, because we're going to discuss it. So does anyone want to state what they believe this looks like? My brother.
Okay, the way I believe in that line from Sunday law to COP, I have to go back to 2014 to 2019. So that gives me a clear picture of what you're going to expect in that line.
Any other thoughts?
So we have to understand that when we are going to call them come out of harm my people, so we have to understand very clear that history so that we will be able to explain them how God was leading them to.
Okay. My brother?
I think it look like the history of the letter rain. Because that is, from that dispensation with the letter rain to the history of the 144,000. The 144,000 being for the Christians, it look like the dispensation of the history of 2019.
Saying it'll look like our latter rain doesn't really give us more clarity because we don't know what our latter rain looks like. The subject what I'm trying to get people to see is what does it mean when we go to them and say, come out? Because we already see that they're already a movement and on the right side of the issue. So what do we do for them?
So I was trying to have some thoughts. First, you see that line it's a fractal,
from the big line, we have principles that are repeated from peace. So the first thing I would see is that if you understand well about the harvest of the 144, you would have some concepts also to bring in the line of the Nephilim. So the first thing I would try to observe is that when you come to the line of the 144, the first thing is that these are people who have been following both external and internal events. So they have an internal and an external message. So when we speak of their harvest, these are people who have an experience of both the internal and the external. And so when you come also to the line of the priest, you also see that these are people who are also having an internal and an external. You come also to the line of the Levites, and you know that as we speak, there is a point from Panium where we should go and harvest them. And so because they have been following external events, what I think is going to be taken to them is an internal message. So the same thing I would say for the Nephilims, their harvest to us, I think, as we are going to be giving them an internal message that is in agreement with their external events that they have been following.
What do you mean by internal message?
So a prophetic message that we have. You know, for them, they see the events, but they cannot be able to discern how prophetic it is. So to us, what I'm calling the internal message is the prophetic message. A good example is like Michael Moore knows Trump is the last president, but he does not understand how prophetic it is.
So you're saying that we're going to take them to Bible passages and give them a Bible-based message?
Yes.
And what choice are people going to have to make? Just simply.
Yes.
What choice are they going to have to make?
Either to accept it or deny it.
In more detail.
So
What sides are people
they're
going to
either
take?
going to listen to us with our message and join us, or they're either going to reject us. I also would say that we are also going to be lifted as an ensign. So as we give them the prophetic message, they are learning.
I don't want any other details. I want to keep it really nice and simple.
So come again with your question.
What do we do for them between Sunday law and Daniel 12:1?
So we give them a Bible-based message.
So you're saying we give them a Bible-based message?
Yes.
Okay.
Would be like confirming the external events that will follow. It will give them a clear point on how that they respond to the external message. Be confirmation.
So as we are seeing the coming right now, testing the revenue, what we are following, what we are finding out of what is testing them is as they agree with us, because the external test is in time to test us internally. So what we are getting out of that is the principle. So getting that principle, see from 1989, and compare and contrast it with that one, we are going to give you guys the single principle that will make us.
I don't want the whole explanation. I want your point.
Okay, the point is, the message that we are going to give them from Samuel to others, that we see if we are standing up in Michael, is the message that says, like, come out of my people. Why? How are they God's people?
No rhetorical questions for a start.
To myself, not to you. To myself.
Then answer it. Don't ask the question.
So it's like we are going to we stand up, we stand and like Daniel, and then we say that there is a God in heaven who has designed all these things.
So you're just saying we're going to give them a Bible-based message. That's what you're saying. We're giving them a Bible-based message.
I mean, there must be something concerning God that we have to say to them.
My sister.
It's like this since at the beginning of their life, it's all about external events. That's how they perceive it.
So you'll believe it won't be a Bible-based message, it'll be about external events.
We're going to give them a view about what's happening externally.
So it's a Bible-based message about external events, explaining external events.
Yeah, but mostly external events. Explain that.
Does anyone disagree with this or have a different conclusion? My brother.
I think that context,
Are you just agreeing with this? Then I'll move on. My brother.
Yeah, I want to be specific. On the lines of 144,000, we are seeing three groups: Greece, Levi, and Nephilim. My understanding is that these three groups belong to one side, that is the ethnic side. So from Sunday law to the COP, I think we'll be giving them Bible-based messages. One example is the Sabbath.
So you're agreeing with this?
Yeah.
Okay, please, if you're agreeing with this, put down your hands. I want another thought. Anyone else want to speak? See it differently. My brother.
Like, I just want to say, like, for example, when I view the world, the blue world,
Is it this an explanation of this?
just a little,
No, thank you.
just a little.
No. Anyone else? Yes, my brother. Not this.
Mine is question to those who are having choice number one. I want to ask them a question that I don't understand from their view. Can I ask my question? Okay. So we are going to give them Bible-based message. How then are we going to be different with Protestants who are making the convention taking people to the Bible? Because we are going to take them again to the Bible, and outside the controversy is making Bible with they say. And now we're going to bring them again to our Bible. How are they going to distinguish us from Protestants?
I don't want to answer that question now. I'm just going to note it. How, when Protestants are doing the same. So I don't want to answer that question now. We won't go to that one. Do you have a different... Are you answering this question?
No.
Are you saying something different to this?
Okay, when I look at the flowering of,
Not the whole story.
okay,
Just a
flowering
bit.
of the Netherlands, I've seen that they were really tested by external events. So from 2014 to 2019. So, and I know that these messages are very connected. So therefore, the tests are at loud cry, so will be on external events. So this is what I'm seeing.
So it's not Bible-based? No Bible-based. So it's external events, and we might take them back to Hitler, explain how he's bad, can do World War I, World War II, show how that's repeated under Trump, can do that without Bible. Any religious element whatsoever. So we know that in this history of the harvest, how many groups are formed? 2 groups. What are those 2 groups? Don't give me a parable. In real life, what are those 2 groups? So there's 2 groups here. Saying they're conservatives and liberals. Does anyone disagree with that? Does anyone want to give a different story? It's my brother.
I just to name them, the liberals are the Church of God, the conservatives are the Church of Satan.
Church of God, Church of Satan, in the history of the Sunday law. Anyone else? A different conclusion. So we're saying this is the message and this is the result, the 2 groups. Anyone see this differently? So we're going to go to them with a message. Everyone agrees it has an explanation of external events. Everyone agrees with that. We disagree on whether or not this is going to have a Bible or inspiration base to it, whether or not it's going to have a religious element. We disagree with that. We disagree, or no, we all agree with this. It's going to divide between conservatives and liberals, the conservatives being this side and the liberals being this side. And this side will come and join us. Does anyone disagree with that story? So as people are saying it, as if If you want to give a different interpretation, please raise your hand. But for the few that have spoken so far, this is what I'm seeing. We looked at the ploughing. We see the division occurring between two groups. We're calling these the conservatives. We're calling these the liberals. We come down to the history of the harvest. We're going to give a message for people to come out of Babylon and join us. Now, we do disagree on the nature of that message. Some people say that it is Bible-based, as elements of it incorporates our faith. And incorporated in that message is an explanation of external events. Others see that differently, and they're saying that this doesn't incorporate any requirement of them to change, no morality, no diet, no dress, no nothing. All that we're doing without any religious element is giving them an explanation of external events. So far we've all agreed, all of you have agreed, that this divides two groups, conservatives and liberals, put simply. No one disagrees with this? Okay. We'll come back to this tomorrow. I want you to remember where we came to. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Lord, we know that we are grappling with these things that seem far away, but they become so important for our work. We must understand what our job function is. I pray, Lord, you'll give us greater clarity on these subjects. Thank you for all of our blessings for this school, that it can, all the hard work people have put in to have it running and functioning. And I pray, Lord, that we will all leave it more established in the truth and blessed because of it. I pray, Lord, that you'll be with us through the remainder of our day, through our conversations and studies. In Jesus' name, amen.